Hey there everybody, it's Ryan Liberty. In this video, I'm going to go over 5 signs of emotional abuse. So watch it! Ooh, ah. Okay, so here we are. We're going to go over what 5 signs of emotional abuse are, but before I get to that, I just want to say this is going to be a topic of abuse. And if you find abuse triggering in any way, if it bothers you, if you just can't handle it, you don't have to watch. It's okay. Come back to the video later. If you don't feel like you can ever watch it, that's all right too. You don't have to watch. Also, emotional abuse, I always like to clarify that emotional abuse is a pattern. We all do things that are like a little bit emotionally abusive. It's when we see that this is somebody's way of treating another person over and over and over again. It's a pattern. That's when we would call it emotional abuse. Also, if you are in some way in an emotionally abusive or abusive situation, I want to urge you greatly to seek support. There are resources out there for you. You may have to do a little work to get to them, but believe me, they are out there. There are support groups, there are helplines you can call, shelters, counselors, therapists. So please seek out that support if you are in an abusive relationship. I guarantee you it will be one of the best decisions you make in your life. Now, that out of the way, let's get into what 5 signs of emotional abuse are. So the first sign that I have written down here, and I wrote these down and put a lot of thought into these because it's a little tricky when it comes to emotional abuse because we can't just point to something and say, well, that's it. You know, so we're going to discuss it here. I'm going to do my best, and I hope you'll give me some leeway to do that, and we can discuss it more in the comments below after the video. So the first sign that I have written down is that somebody feels like they can't express themselves. We call this like walking on eggshells. When somebody feels like they can't express themselves, it's often because somebody else is telling them things or sending them messages like, you need to just shut up. Or when they do express themselves, they're kind of neglected, like that emotion is not even recognized. Maybe there's just a silent treatment that goes on when somebody expresses themselves. So basically what I'm talking about here is emotional invalidation, and I do have a video on invalidation, so check that out. And I just want to clarify that if somebody feels like they can't express themselves, it can't be that that person is maybe avoiding having a confrontation. This is where it gets a little tricky, right? So if I'm just afraid to bring up how I'm feeling because I'm afraid of confrontation generally with anybody, then that's not emotional abuse. It's because we've brought things up in the past and we've been invalidated. That's emotional abuse. You have to at least have brought something up to the other person's attention a couple of times, or a few times, and that person has shot you down, maybe criticized you, yelled at you, silent treatment, neglect, whatever it is. That would be one sign of emotional abuse. The second sign of emotional abuse that I have is that somebody is speaking for somebody else. So, you know, maybe the other person's not around and then they're giving that person's opinion for them all the time, or that person makes choices for them or decides what the other person gets to do or can't do. That would be speaking for someone else. You know, I like to always say that abuse thrives in isolation, and a great way to isolate somebody is to make all the decisions for them without their presence. And I have to say here that when we're talking about speaking for somebody else, it can get confusing because you may only be friends with one of the 2 people involved, for example. So how do you know if this person's speaking for the other person? Well, it's not always obvious what's going on. It is tricky, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, so you won't know who is abusive unless you speak to both people, but there is a clue that you can look for, so that would be number 3. So a good sign to figure out who was abusive would be to look for somebody who is unable to look at themselves critically. If you speak to both people, and I recommend if you're trying to assess the situation, you really should always speak to both people to get the 2 different perspectives on things. If you find that one of them is not able to look at their own part in things, if they are not able to accept criticism, and they may fake it, they may act like, well, yeah, I know I should have done this better, I should have done that better. But if they're not really self-reflective, if they're not able to see how they could have made different choices, that may be an indication that they were the emotionally abusive person. And the reason I say this, I know it's not cut and dry, but I say this is because that person typically is not, if they're not able to show self-reflection here, they probably weren't able to show self-reflection throughout the relationship with the other person that we're talking about. And so they wouldn't be able to, again, see their own part in things, and they'd be invalidating the other person's experience. I hope that makes sense. So then we get to number 4, the 4th sign of emotional abuse, which is that somebody is apologizing for their actions, but they're not changing. So, you know, somebody who cheats, and then they say, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again, but then they cheat again, or multiple times. Or, you know, you find out that somebody, or you don't even have to find out anything. Maybe somebody was just rude to you, telling you, like, I don't like you, I hate you, and you're disgusting, like criticism basically. And you say to them, you know, please don't do that to me anymore, I don't appreciate it, or I'm gonna leave. And then they say, well, I won't do that anymore. Come a week later, they're doing it again. So if somebody's apologizing, saying, I'm sorry, I hurt you, take me back, I love you, that kind of a thing, but then their behavior is not changing, that is emotionally abusive. So if you can find that somebody's not changing what they're doing, and they consistently apologize for it, that's emotional abuse. And then the 5th thing that I've written down for emotional abuse, a sign of emotional abuse, is minimizing, which is again a form of invalidation, and it's also a form sometimes of victim blaming. I've got a video for that too. So I have down that minimizing is kind of like joking about the things that happen, like, oh, that didn't really matter, or, you know, I don't know why you're so bothered by that, or maybe saying, you know, that happened 4 years ago, that doesn't matter anymore, you need to just get over it and move on. And I've written down a couple of phrases here because they're things that I've heard minimizing things, and you may have heard them yourselves. So things like, well, there's 2 sides to every story, which kind of implies like, well, your side only matters a little bit. Or basically like, well, I hear what you're saying, but I don't really care because I believe somebody else more than you. If you really want to be compassionate for somebody, you listen to their side and you acknowledge and accept it as, at least in the moment, you kind of accept it as the truth and try to understand their perspective and validate their experience. So there's 2 sides to every story. It, to me, is minimizing, and it's not nice. And it's also a sign of emotional abuse because you're minimizing the other person's experience. There's also things like, well, you're just misinterpreting what happened. Calm down, it's really not that serious. Or, well, if you didn't do X, Y, and Z, then they wouldn't have done X, Y, and Z. Or, well, or you may hear the person who is abusive saying something like, well, I did everything that I could to help that other person. Again, it's all minimizing the experience of the person who is saying that they were abused. If you're not able to just sit and listen to that person, really hear what they're saying, take in the information, see if they're being self-reflective, and see if they're admitting to maybe being a part of the problem, then you're not really able to assess what's going on, and you're not going to be able to see whether or not there was emotional abuse going on. But people who are emotionally abusive, again, I'll say they like to isolate other people, and one way to isolate people is to say things like, well, there's 2 sides to every story. Or, well, if they didn't do this, then I wouldn't have done that. That's a way of keeping the responsibility off of themselves and onto the other person. So those are 5 signs of emotional abuse. There are many more ways to find emotional abuse, and I'd love to hear some of the ways that you see it, because I know it's a little bit of a tricky topic here. It's not something that's so obvious, again, because when there's physical abuse, you can see a mark on the person's body, and that's not always even true, but at least some of the time you can see it. It's something more concrete that you can point to, but I'd love to hear the ways that you've seen emotional abuse, because it is a confusing topic, and it's unfortunate that it's confusing because it allows people to get away with emotionally abusive behavior, but I'm doing my best here with this channel to try to show a well-rounded perspective on what emotional abuse is, and to get everybody into perspective on what's going on when we're talking about emotional abuse. So I definitely appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. I'd love to hear your comments. Please leave them below, and thank you. Hey, it's Ryan Liberty. If you like that video, please give it a thumbs up, share with a friend, and leave any questions or comments down below because that would really help me out. If you're somebody who's gone through a traumatic event and you're feeling cut off from the people around you, I have a free course that will help with that, so please click to get it. And if you'd like to see the rest of my videos, please click subscribe. As always, I want to remind you that your life matters. Nobody can question your worth. However it is that you're feeling, whatever it is that you're going through, it's okay, and you are loved. Thanks again for watching.